Imagine turning the key on your car, and instead of a normal engine, a jet engine, the same kind of engine that powers an actual airplane, screams to life under the hood. That is not science fiction. Chrysler actually built that car in 1963, handed it to real families for free, and told them to drive it to work like normal people. It ran on diesel. It ran on kerosene. It even ran on tequila. And it worked so well that families begged to keep theirs, some of them literally mailing Chrysler blank checks. Then, a few years later, Chrysler rounded almost all of them up and burned them to the ground. This is the story of a flying machine engine that actually worked in a family car and still vanished before the world ever got to keep it. To understand how something this strange got built, you have to go back to a small group of engineers at Chrysler in the 1950s who were obsessed with one idea. What if a car engine had almost no parts that could wear out? A normal engine works by exploding fuel over and over inside metal pistons, thousands of times a minute. That's why it rattles, vibrates, and eventually breaks down. A jet-style turbine engine doesn't explode anything. It just spins, constantly, like a fan, which means far fewer parts grinding against each other, and in theory, an engine that almost never wears out. By the mid-1950s, Chrysler's engineers had already proven the basic idea worked by bolting a turbine into an ordinary Plymouth and driving it across the country. What they didn't have yet was proof that regular people, not test drivers, not engineers, could actually live with a car like this. So, in February of 1962, Chrysler loaded a few turbine prototypes onto trucks and toured 90 cities across North America, Europe, and Mexico, giving free rides to nearly 14,000 strangers off the street. When they polled people afterward, 30% said they'd buy one immediately if they could. Another 54% said they'd seriously think about it. That's not a polite response to a science project. That's a company sitting on something people actually wanted parked in their driveway. So, Chrysler did something no car company has really done before or since. They hand-built 50 of these turbine cars with the bodies crafted in Italy by a coach builder called Ghia, then shipped to Detroit for the engines to be installed, and gave them away for free 3 months at a time to ordinary American families. Every single one was painted the same shade of bronze, a color Chrysler literally named after the engine's exhaust flame. Each car reportedly cost around $55,000 to build, over $500,000 today, handed to a stranger to take grocery shopping. On October 29, 1963, in Chicago, Chrysler's own president personally handed the keys to a systems engineer named Richard Viaja and his wife. Over the next 2 years, 203 people in 133 cities across the country would each get one of these jet engine cars for a season of their life. All they had to pay for was fuel. And here's the part that made people's jaws drop. The engine barely cared what kind of fuel you gave it. Regular gasoline worked, diesel worked, kerosene worked, actual jet fuel worked. In France, Chrysler ran one on Chanel No. 5 perfume just to prove a point. When the president of Mexico jokingly asked if tequila counted as flammable, Chrysler's engineers actually tried it, and the car ran on tequila. A machine you could fuel up with the same liquid you'd pour into a shot glass. That alone should tell you this wasn't a novelty act. For 2 years, it was living in ordinary driveways, doing ordinary errands. But here's what you need to hold on to, because it's exactly where this story is headed. A car families loved so much, they tried to buy it with blank checks still got taken away for good on purpose by the same company that built it. We're going to get to exactly why. But first, you need to see how well this thing actually performed, because that's what makes the ending so hard to accept. The engine itself had roughly 80% fewer moving parts than a normal engine, spun at idle speeds between 18,000 and over 40,000 RPM, and never once needed an oil change during the entire test program. It made 130 horsepower and 425 pound-feet of torque, genuinely strong numbers for a 1963 car, and because it burned fuel in a smooth, continuous stream instead of violent little explosions, there was almost none of the rattling or vibration people were used to. Drivers described it as gliding rather than driving. The reliability numbers back it up too. When the program started, the fleet needed repairs about 4% of the time. By the time it wrapped up in January of 1966, that number had dropped to just 1%, improved almost entirely from real families driving real roads in real weather, not lab testing. Across the whole program, drivers logged more than 1 million miles combined. One man named Mark Olson, whose father was picked for the program, remembered that you barely got to actually drive it because strangers kept flagging you down just to stare at it and ask questions. That's not a car people merely tolerated. That's a car people fell in love with. So, if it worked this well, and people wanted it this badly, what actually killed it? Two things, and neither one is the story most people assume. The popular myth is that Chrysler destroyed the cars to dodge an import tax on the Italian-made bodies. It's a great story. It's also mostly false. Historians who ran the actual numbers found the total tariff on all 55 cars combined would have been around $23,000. Nothing compared to what Chrysler had already spent. The real reason was simpler and, in a way, more human. These were experimental cars with no repair shops, no spare parts network, nothing. Chrysler was terrified of a future where one broke down on a family's driveway with no mechanic anywhere near able to fix it, or someone ripping the jet engine out and bolting in a normal one just to keep the car running. A Chrysler executive said it plainly to Look magazine at the time. Their goal was research, and they didn't want these engines turning up on used car lots. So in 1967, at a scrapyard south of Detroit, workers punched holes in the gas tanks of 45 cars, drained the fuel straight into the handmade Italian leather interiors, and set them on fire. A 46th was destroyed separately at Chrysler's own test grounds. The second reason is what actually killed the entire jet engine car idea for good over a decade later. Burning fuel in a constant stream, instead of small controlled bursts, creates a lot more of a pollutant called nitrogen oxide. Exactly what the Clean Air Act was starting to crack down on hard through the 1970s. Chrysler kept trying to fix it. They took a $6.4 million research contract from the government to chase a solution. But by 1979, with the company nearly bankrupt and taking a federal bailout, the government made shutting the turbine program down a literal condition of the loan. A federal report back in 1967 had already concluded, bluntly, that the technology was unsuited to cars. Building an actual factory to mass-produce these engines would have cost close to $1 billion, with each engine running about $10,000 to build. The car that could run on tequila couldn't survive spreadsheets and smog laws. Only 9 of the original 55 cars still exist. Chrysler kept 2. 6 sit in museums, including the Smithsonian and the Henry Ford Museum, and 1 belongs to comedian Jay Leno, who still starts it up and drives it today, more than 60 years after it left a factory in Detroit. When a museum director recently took one out to prep it for a car show, his first reaction wasn't about horsepower or torque at all. He said it felt exactly like the flying cars from the Jetsons, a cartoon vision of tomorrow that, for 2 brief years in the real 1960s, had actually existed and actually worked. That's the whole strange shape of this story. Chrysler didn't fail to build a jet-powered family car. They succeeded. 203 ordinary people drove one to work, to church, to the grocery store, for over 1 million combined miles, and it held up. The failure wasn't the engineering. It was everything engineering can't fix: cost, regulation, and a company too nervous about its own success to let it loose in the real world. Decades later, car companies are still chasing the same dream Chrysler already proved could work once. The turbine car didn't fail to change the industry. The industry just wasn't ready to let it.